Morning reading. We're going to look at page, we're holding at part F4, which is on page 17. We're going to go to the bottom of page 16. And we'll use that where it says, what are we left with? We'll use that as a way to recap where we're holding. So what are we left with? So these are just my words. If kappa were the only factor, right? We learned that there's a dispute in the Mishnah as to whether charoset is a mitzvah or not. If it is not a mitzvah, the Gemara explained for us that the charoset would be a health benefit to neutralize what is called kappa. We discussed what that might be. Essentially, at least according to the majority opinion, as we learned, it's a tiny worm that's detrimental to one's health if one consumes it. And back in the old day, maror would have his little kappa in it, and charoset would neutralize it. Yeah. So, therefore, if kappa was the only factor, the ingredients and texture wouldn't really matter, as long as the item you're dipping it into has this neutralizing effect, right? So long as kappa is neutralized, that would be the only issue. So we also explained, the reason why I'm saying this is because as we learned last week, the idea of charoses, it's clear from the Gemara of the Talmud, was something known to the reader already, because the Gemara doesn't give ingredients. It doesn't say you have to have charoset. What's it made out of? X, Y, and Z. It doesn't say so. It assumes you already know what it is. It tells you that it neutralizes kappa, because you know what kappa is already, because you're the reader of the Talmud in, I don't know, in what is it, in the 3rd and 4th century Babylonia. So you know what these health risks of kappa is already. You know what charoset is already also. And the Mishnah tells you, make sure you have it. That's it. And then the Mishnah tells you, the Gemara tells you how to behave with it. So for example, the Mishnah says, when you dip your charoset, when you dip your maror into kappa and charoset, because you want to neutralize the kappa, make sure you shake it off, because you don't want to ruin the flavor of your maror. Because apparently there was some sweetness in the charoses. That would be the only thing we know about the ingredients if kappa was the factor, that there's some sweetness in it, and therefore shake it off so you don't ruin the flavor of your maror. But you already know what it is. And therefore, when the Gemara introduces the mitzvah component of charoset and says, as we learned last week, different elements of the mitzvah, the apple, the this, the that, but the primary, as we learned and as we demonstrated, the primary mitzvah of charoset is to remember the mortar of the Jewish people living in Egypt. So then the Gemara tells us the manner in which you should make the charoset, because you already know what charoset is, but do it in such a manner that it mimics mortar. Number one, it should be thick, like a mortar. And number two, the Gemara told us that you should add spices, which we learned based on the Tosfos and others. The spices means it should be stringy, like straw that's added to the mortar that makes it look more like mortar. This is where the idea of cinnamon comes from. You put like string of cinnamon. I don't know if that's the custom that people actually put strings of cinnamon. I think people put ground cinnamon.
Doesn't the Rebbe say no cinnamon on pizza?
We don't. We'll get that in a second. We don't put on cinnamon. That's correct. We'll get that, God willing, in a second. But in theory, I'm just asking those who do cinnamon in your houses, do you have string cinnamon or ground? Sorry? Morning. If you do it, sorry? You do pure Chabad custom, which is no cinnamon. Sorry? No? I'm wondering, in Ashkenazi home, when you cinnamon? That's far to do cinnamon. Sorry?
I'm going to see this year and let you know.
Okay.
But it's possible.
It's
possible that there could be some cinnamon. I don't went into the kitchen too much. It's a bad place for me. So.
Okay. So if it's a mitzvah, again, we have now texture. Number one, thick, and mimic the texture of the mortar. And then number two was, we learned another source, the Jerusalem Talmud, the Yerushalmi, cited by the Tosfos in our Talmud, which states that it should also be runny to mimic blood. So, which is the opposite of thick. And therefore, look at point 2 on the bottom of top of 17. The mitzvah's primary concern is number one, texture, first thick to mimic the mortar, and then runny to mimic the blood. And number two, the Gemara told us there should be a tart taste, which we weren't sure what tart taste was. Tart taste could be associated with the apple, which was a positive thing, that the Jews got blessing under the apple orchard, they had children, etc. But we learned that actually the tart flavor is because their teeth became blackened, which is part of the negative, part of the suffering, such to the point that the teeth got blackened, and the word for tart, kiyua, is the same root word for black, teeth, kiyua. Okay, so ingredients essentially are not so important, or better said, you already know what ingredients you have because you already had charoses, because charoses is an existing factor for you as a reader of the Talmud in the 4th century Babylonia. But the Gemara is telling you because it's a mitzvah tonight. Well, let's put it this way: you always have charoses whenever you have lettuce,
Yeah.
because you got to kill kappa,
Mhm.
right? We learned already. Rebbe Tzadok, who says it's a mitzvah, is not saying kappa doesn't exist. He's just saying you have to deal with kappa because that's just the reality of the ground.
Mhm.
But there's also a mitzvah component, and therefore you're going to make your charoses anyway to make sure it neutralizes your kappa. But because tonight it's a mitzvah, make sure you make your charoses in the next fashion. Number one, thick texture, mimic mortar, and then add liquid later to make it runny, to mimic blood, and make sure it has that tart taste, which mimics the blackened teeth or symbolizes word association with blackened teeth. Okay, so this is where we are.
This is the recipe: dates, apple, nuts, cinnamon, wine.
Okay,
That's already
ask
made.
how the cinnamon is made. Is it stringy or ground? Like strings of sticks of cinnamon or ground? I'm curious about that. Okay, so now let's look at part 4. So because now we have the essential ingredients, really is not a factor. It's a question of the texture. That's primary, with the exception of tart taste, which we said has to be there for the blackened teeth business. But in essence, the ingredients themselves aren't as important, right? Which explains why all these kinds of different communities had different kind of customs. Yeah. So there's a Talmudic commentary that Tosfos on our Talmud, which reads, so you can see it there, the Hebrew, I didn't translate it into English, quoting from the Gaonim. The Gaonim is the era just after the Talmud, but whilst the Jews are still in Babylonia, so they're the closest post-Talmudic link to the Talmud era generation, and they have certain traditions, oral traditions, that aren't even, incorporated into the Talmud, because they're still in Babylonia, they haven't left. So they write certain preferred ingredients, not primary, because primary, again, for the mitzvah is the texture of tart and then runny, but they have preferred ingredients. And what are they? Let's look at the next text, which is the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, by Alter Rebbe, at the bottom of page 17, where there I do have the English translation, and essentially he's citing this text. It reads, the CHAROSES should be made from fruits that are used as metaphors for the Jewish people. For example, figs, as is written, the fig tree has sprouted its buds. Or nuts, as it is written, I descended to the nut garden. Date, as it is written, I will ascend the date palm. Pomegranates, as it is written, like the flights of pomegranates. And apples, recalling this verse, beneath the apple tree I aroused you. For in Egypt, the Jewish women would give birth to their children beneath the apple trees without sorrow. So the apple tree component in halacha is not listed as a primary ingredient, but as a preferred ingredient, along with pomegranates, dates, or any other ingredients that are associated with the Jewish people. Continuing, the charoses should also include almonds, shekedim, for the Holy One, blessed be He, hurried, shaked, same root word as shekedim, the redemption, and brought it about. Okay.
All mixed together.
Sorry?
All mixed together.
All mixed together. So indeed, many communities actually do this. They have dates and pomegranates and apples
What does it say? The
and
portion?
cinnamon and nuts and what else I'm missing? And wine for the tart,
What about
for the running.
What about the portions? Like it's just an equal amount of each, or because you said it has to be more, you can.
It doesn't really matter as long as
Doesn't
it
matter.
makes them order. The point. But the point, Tanner, they're making this point that there's the primary and the secondary. Doesn't matter how much, as long as you get that result of the thick
Order thickness.
and then the running. Okay, so after knowing all this, let's go to our unanswered questions in the bottom of 18. And then we're going to look at the Rebbe's Haggadah and see how the Rebbe resolves all of our questions. Will, can I ask you to just close the door behind you if you don't mind, please? Thank you. Sorry?
Powder form, the cinnamon.
Oh, it's powder form, not stringy? Okay, interesting. So our first question is, after everything we learned from the last 3 weeks, 2.5 weeks, 2 weeks and then now. Number one, why don't we recite a bracha on charoses? That's the big mitzvah. Considering the only reason to do so today is that it is a mitzvah. Right? So let's recap what we remember from about this. The Rambam introduced us, the Rambam in his commentary to the Mishnah said that the difference between saying charoses is a mitzvah or saying charoses is not a mitzvah is whether you make a bracha. Which bracha? Which bracha would you make if it's a bracha? If it's a mitzvah?
Shirako, no?
Sorry?
Shirako?
What does that have to do with the mitzvah?
Because it's all mixed up, no?
But what does that have to do with the mitzvah? We're saying if charoset there's a mitzvah, you have to make a bracha. Meaning the bracha shakal, which either it's shakal or eitz, right? But that bracha would be relevant to it being a mitzvah. You have to eat, whenever you eat food, you have to make a bracha, right? That's called birchas hanehenin, the blessing of before enjoying something. But we're saying here the bracha of mitzvah. If it's a mitzvah, you would say, Asher kedushanim mitzvahs mitzvanu al achilas CHAROSES, which we do not do. Why not? If all we have left is mitzvah, because kappa, the health issue, is no longer a concern. It's out. There's no longer this worm. So if all that's left is mitzvah, why aren't we making a bracha? Right? Now, we had the suggestion which you mentioned a few weeks ago, that because it's a machlokes, it's a dispute in the Gemara, if it's a mitzvah or not a mitzvah, and therefore, whenever you're in doubt as to whether something is a mitzvah or not, you do it, but don't make a bracha, because safek bracha is l'hakol. For example, okay, this is a disputed example, but still a good one, and I like sharing it, and I think it's correct. If you're putting on tefillin with someone after shkia, first of all, should you? Before it says, right, there's a time period between shkia, sunset, and nightfall when it's doubt, is a part of day or is a part of night. So you meet a Jew, Banish Mashas. So you meet a Jew who hasn't put on tefillin that day. Should you put on tefillin with him at that point? Or it's already night, it's too late, it's not worth anything. Well, it's doubt. Maybe it's part of day. So do it without a bracha. Because anytime you're in doubt as to whether you're performing a mitzvah, you do it, no bracha. So therefore, if there's a machlokes, if charoset is a mitzvah, then do it, but no bracha. That was a suggestion answer. It fails us for two reasons. Number one, the Lechem Mishnah seems to be clear that if we're taking a mitzvah, it should be a bracha. So in this position, certainly you would say it's a bracha you would certainly make a bracha if it's a mitzvah, according to the Lechem Mishnah. But more importantly, that only explains why we don't make a bracha. But why don't we have a kazayas? Why don't we have a measure? Because when it comes to any mitzvah, there's always a measurable amount. There's always a measure. There's a shear. Your tefillin has to be a certain size. You have eat matzah, you have to eat a certain amount of matzah. You have to eat a certain amount of maror. So if CHAROSES is a mitzvah, even if it's in doubt for a mitzvah, why aren't we eating a kazayas? Or at the very least, we have this other view to dip it in to a kazayas. This is an obligation we don't see anywhere, and why not?
But for somebody who doesn't know and they do the bracha anyway, is that really a serious thing?
I don't think anybody's making a bracha by accident. Blessed are you, God, Allah, with commandment of CHAROSES. It's not written in Haggadah. Why would anybody make such a mistake? Yeah. Okay.
More likely to miss a bracha than not a bracha.
Yes, better miss a bracha than add a bracha. Yeah.
No, I'm saying more likely to miss a bracha.
Oh, they're more likely to miss a bracha than add it. Yes. Okay. Point one. Point two. Why does Alter Rebbe refer to both apple and water regarding the setting? Okay, well, we'll skip this one because it's not going to go there. Skip the next 2 points. Is that going to go there? Okay, that's our main concern. Why don't we make a bracha? So I want to go to there's the next 3 pages. I think it's right. It's 19, 20, and 21 are all the Rebbe's comments to the Haggadah. But let's first understand how the Rebbe's commentary to the Haggadah works, so you know what I'm talking about. We've been quoting till now the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch code of Jewish law. So let's just understand what that is. The Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad, wrote a code of Jewish law. This code of Jewish law, for the most part at least, he wrote early on in his life. Later in his life, he amended some of his thinking. These amendations, these changes in his thinking, we do not have most of them. In fact, he wrote an entire second version of the Shulchan Aruch, which is completely non-extant. It's burnt, it doesn't exist. So we only have the first version. But here and there, we know of different areas in which he amended and changed his view for whatever reason. Not for now. The Alter himself wrote what are the considerations that made him change his mind, but we'll leave that alone for now. But that's the reality, he did. Now, one of the ways in which we see where the Alter Rebbe changed his mind in certain practices is in his Siddur. So, in addition to writing a code, he also wrote a Siddur. What does that mean to write a Siddur? There were many scholars who have written Siddurim throughout the ages. To write a Siddur meant that A, you compiled the precise variant of the text that you felt was correct. Right? You variant the text. You put Haidu before Baruch Shamar or Haidu after Baruch Shamar. In the text of Baruch Shamar, do you pronounce it this way or do you pronounce it that way? Right? So that's number one, is you choose the text that you feel is the most accurate. And when you're doing that, you can take various different things into consideration. You can take grammatical things. You want to make sure it's grammatically most correct. You can focus on the halacha to make sure you're fulfilling all the halachic obligations of davening. And you can also focus on the Kabbalistic. You want the words to match the Kabbalistic intention, the different considerations you might take. And each siddur focuses on 1, 2, 3, or more other considerations. Yeah? Okay. Now, in addition to collecting the text, writing a siddur also means you're writing instructions. So if you look at your siddur, any, whether it's Art Scroll or the Kahas or any other, it's going to include instructions. Raise your tzitzis here, hold it in such and such a way. When you come to this word, take your tzitzis, put it to your eyes, and kiss it. When you come to this point, touch your tefillin and kiss your hand. And when you go to Shabbos, it'll say, raise your becher here, and so on. So, and the sitting will come to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, bang your foot here, stand here, sit here, bow here, etc. All these little instructions. Yeah. The same thing is true of the Seder night. A siddur, the siddur we have, is a siddur that tells you how to daven every day and on Shabbos. But writing a siddur in the old day meant you were writing any liturgy that a Jew has to recite throughout the entire year. So siddur, machzer, Haggadah would all be wrapped into one siddur, which takes you through all the liturgy you have to say of the year. So in the Alter Rebbe's siddur, it also includes a Haggadah. And that Haggadah includes instructions. Do this here, dip your maror here, eat your matzah here, make the bracha here, lean to the left here, all kinds of instructions. And there are a number of instances in which the instructions, as they appear in the Haggadah, could be different than the instructions as they appear in the Code of Jewish Law.
The one with the siddur because it was more recent.
So for Chabad, we go with the siddur. There are those who, for whatever reason, follow directly the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch without taking into consideration the siddur. Not in Chabad, but other Hasidic circles who are mostly the Hasidic circles who are of Russian extract. So Skver, which is really a Russian Hasidus, not a Polish or even Hungarian. And even in the Hungarian ones, Satmar, for example, they follow the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch all the way. Yeah, but not necessarily to take into consideration the siddur, for whatever reason. But in Chabad, we would take into consideration the Alter Rebbe siddur. Okay, now, yeah, that's the Haggadah. The Haggadah that a Chabadnik uses is the Haggadah as it appears in the Alter Rebbe siddur, with those instructions as it appears in the Alter Rebbe siddur. Good. Now, the Rebbe wrote a commentary to the Haggadah, and the Rebbe's commentary to the Haggadah is going to be a running commentary on the text and instructions as they appear in the Alter Rebbe siddur. Clear? So those are our layers. All right. So with that in mind, let's read. I'm going to skip to bottom of page 20, because I want to read the instruction where he describes when dipping the maror in CHAROSES. And if we have time, we'll come back to the other comment, because this comment here is really going to answer our main question: why, if it's a mitzvah, we're not treating it like a mitzvah, which is with a bracha and a kazayas. So on the bottom of page 20, what you have there is the Alter Rebbe siddur with the instructions of what to do by maror. So it says, maror, that's the next step. And afterwards, after having eaten your matzah, yikach kazayis maror, you take a kazayis of maror, yitlo b'CHAROSES, and you dip it into the CHAROSES, the yinar HaCHAROSES, and you should shake off the CHAROSES, my olive, from the maror, you should shake it off after you dipped it. So that you do not nullify the flavor of the bitterness of the maror. We learned that from the Gemara already. And then the author says, and you shall recite the following bracha. And then the bracha is written out. And then after the bracha it says, you shall eat it without leaning to the left. Right? Because it's a maror, it's bitter, no leaning to the left. All right. Now let's look at Rebbe's commentary. Rebbe is now going to comment on these different instructions. So page 21. The Yitlo b'CHAROSES. The Alter Rebbe said, dip your maror into CHAROSES. Comment the Rebbe. The koydem atfila, prior to your dipping into CHAROSES, merachech HaCHAROSES, you soften the CHAROSES, you liquefy it, beyayin shebesoich kli, with wine that it's in your vessel. Right, this we learned already. Your CHAROSES has to begin out thick like mortar, but then it has to go runny. So before you dip, liquefy it. The Chabad custom actually is to take the CHAROSES, to take a scoop of CHAROSES which is dry, put it onto the plate that was under your becher, right, your kiddush cup, which the entire time was spilling over with wine. So you take the CHAROSES, put it into there, The Rebbe would actually mix it with his finger and then dip. That's the custom. Then he continues. The ein mishakeya kol hachazayis b'charoses. You should not dunk the entire kazayis of your moror into your charoses. Don't submerge it completely. Why? V'sha'ata ein motzei kappa. Because today we don't have this kappa, which is parentheses mintelas, a kind of worm. The moror in the moror kemoy b'meshas, as there was at the time of the shas, and therefore the ein makbilim b'charoses. You should not dip the charoses. We only have it left. The only item left is now to remember that it's the mortar. And therefore, do not submerge your charoses all the way into the mortar. Does anybody remember the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, how he phrased it? Let's look at the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. Go back to page. Page 13. The instruction with Alter Rebbe says you don't need to submerge the mortar. Page 13. In the present era, this is Alter Rebbe's quoted Jewish law. In the present era, it is not customary to submerge the mortar entirely in the charoses, only to dip a portion into it. There are those who justify the custom, explaining that kappa is not found at present. The mortar is dipped in the charoses only as a mitzvah because of the charoses, because of the mortar. So if you read this, what would be the preferred method? Submerge or dip?
Yeah.
Read it again.
No, submerge is the preferred.
We're going to justify it.
But we're saying you don't have to do that anymore.
No,
because
it's not customary to submerge.
But continue.
There are those who just got
Justify the custom, meaning really you should submerge,
Yeah.
because kappa was the original thing.
Exactly.
But because kappa doesn't exist, we're going to justify it and not dip.
Exactly.
Now let's see how the Rebbe writes it. Meaning the Rebbe is taking from the Siddur, not from the Haggadah, right? Not from the Shulchan Aruch. Let's see how the Rebbe says it. The Rebbe says it. Back to page 21. The ein makbilim b'charoses el mishum. Sorry. Ein mishakeya kol ha'kazayis b'charoses. Do not submerge the entire kazayis in charoses. V'sha'at ein motzei kappa. Because today we don't have kappa. Mintela is not warm. The mortar and the mortar kamei b'shas as it was in the Talmud times. The ein makbilim b'charoses el mishum mitzvah zeich latit. And we only dip the charoset for nothing other than the reason that there's a mitzvah to remember the mortar. Then in the parentheses, he puts the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, the source for this thing.
Mm-hmm.
Then the Rebbe adds a line after putting the source, because the next line is not going to be in the source from the Alter Rebbe. The source from the Alter Rebbe said, justifying why we don't submerge. Then the Rebbe adds a line. It's better not to submerge the whole thing. So you shouldn't ruin the flavor of the mortar.
Right.
If we don't want you to ruin the flavor of the mortar, and you no longer have kappa, then better don't. Cain F. Shalimar. Perhaps this is what we might say.
How can you justify it by saying there's no kappa these days?
There's no kappa.
There is no
Exactly.
kappa.
So why would you put it entirely?
Because, good question. Very good question. One can make the case, and there are those who say this, that when Rebbe ben Tzadok said it's a mitzvah, and we already established, he's not negating the notion of kappa. Kappa is a reality, right? So there are those who learn that actually, Rebbe ben Tzadok is saying, there's a mitzvah because you have a mitzvah to take care of your health. And the mitzvah is to get rid of kappa. What's an example of a mitzvah that's for your health? Also related to eating? Anybody?
Fish and meat or
Fishing is a minhag.
isn't
Like, not a mitzvah, but actually it's a sakana. But okay, maybe that would be a negative though. Don't eat fish and meat. It's a positive.
What's a positive?
Give me a positive mitzvah, rabbinic mitzvah that is for health consideration, a consideration which almost never exists today. Sorry, that's a biblical mitzvah, nothing to do with health.
Oh, health.
Give me a
Chazer.
rabbinic mitzvah. That's a health consideration that almost is non-existent today, but we still do it all the time. Also related to eating.
Don't walk out when you eat.
No, a positive mitzvah to do something.
Wash hands.
Sit
or-
down.
Which washing hands? Which one? Which hand wash?
Before you eat.
Before you eat, there's a rabbinic mitzvah not to remember the tuman tara, to remember purity and impurity. No, which washing of the hands?
Oh,
White food.
No. Negavas is also tuman tara. My machrena.
Oh.
What's my machrena for? The water you wash your hands before you eat.
Oh, right.
For the
right,
salt.
Salt.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's a mitzvah.
That's the salt of stone.
Fine.
Yeah.
Does it exist today in your house?
No.
No. But so why you do it? It's a rabbinic mitzvah. So why not make a bracha Hashem Kisharu Tzitz V'Tzivonu Al Tisadayim? Just like make Al Tisadayim before the meal. You're making Tzadim before the meal, even to rabbinic mitzvah. So why aren't you making a bracha and Tzadim on your Mayim Achronim? Answer, because whenever there's a mitzvah for the sake of health, you don't make a bracha. So you could make the case.
Oh, so then he's not talking about health. So then you can argue against that he's not talking about.
So you could make the case that the mitzvah that a Elazar Metzodik is saying is a mitzvah of getting rid of kappa. If that were the case, then even if the kappa doesn't exist anymore, you should submerge it completely.
Right.
To maintain the mitzvah of health that was.
But there should be no bracha.
But if there's no kappa anymore, so first the Rebbe says, okay, we'll justify kappa doesn't exist anymore, so you have to submerge completely. But the Rebbe is taking a step further. If we're deleting kappa, we're deleting it completely, not part of the consideration. And if it's only mitzvah, not a mitzvah because there once was kappa, only a mitzvah because we're remembering the mortar. And if it's only a mitzvah to remember the mortar, then you should not submerge it to avoid ruining the flavor of your mortar. Not just justify it, but you should not. Yeah? See, the Rebbe is adding a nuance here. And this is important, because we'll see in a moment, because the Rebbe is going to, even though I mentioned this last week, I'm writing the narrative of the CHAROSES story because I want to lead down to the Rebbe's opinion. We could have written the narrative very differently and lead somewhere else. And the narrative I've been pushing is that the essence of CHAROSES is the mortar. Even though there were other issues, like the apple, to remember that Hashem blessed us with the tree, that they had babies in the tree, and there's a kappa. But we're slowly eliminating all those factors and zooming in on the mortar. And Rebbe is doing that even more here by saying, even to remember the fact that there was kappa is off. Because if we were there to remember there was kappa, it might have been preferred to submerge.
Right.
And now we're saying, no, not just it's preferred, but we're going to justify it. Don't submerge. Better not to submerge. There's a nuance that the Rebbe is adding here that's not in the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch justifies the custom of not submerging, and the Rebbe is preferring it.
Well, it makes sense though, because the maros was something you're making a bracha on.
Sorry?
The mara is something you made a bracha on. It's something you're supposed to
Oh.
eat intact. So it would take precedence over
the
CHAROSES.
CHAROSES. Yeah, which again begs the question: if it's really a mitzvah, then you're doing a mitzvah where you're not even tasting it. What's the mitzvah here? What's the mitzvah CHAROSES? To have it, to dip, or to eat?
To dip. It really sounds like it is to dip, to remember the
Because
water.
you're getting rid of the flavor, right? So what kind of mitzvah is this? So if that's the case, maybe you should dip into a kazayas, because the dipping is a mitzvah. But we don't do that anyway.
It's just to
Or
remember.
maybe we should have a bracha. Asher kedushan mitzvah mitzvanu litbal b'charesis. To dip into charesis instead of a mitzvah alachilas charesis. Which, by the way, the Rambam, when he suggested that you should make a bracha on the mitzvah of charesis, he suggested the mitzvah, the bracha of achilas, eat. So there's an eating component. We also learned, by the way, that there's a mitzvah to have it on the table. Because you have to recite the Haggadah in the presence of charesis, which is not the essence of mitzvah, just like it's not the essence of mitzvah of matzah to have it on the table, but it's halacha to have it on the table. Okay. But now it's becoming more clear that yes, the mitzvah is to dip, not the eating, because shake it off and barely dip it in, you don't want to submerge it. And number two, it's really not about the kappa or anything else. Not just that kappa was a thing and now maybe we want to remember it. No, off the table kappa. It was a health concern. It's not a health concern. We're stripped that away. The mitzvah is left is only to remember the mortar.
There's consistency.
Oh, so which means the essence of it is the consistency of the mortar and then the runny to remember the blood. But really, you're right that the essence is the consistency of the thickness. Yeah, which is perhaps why we only add the runny at the last minute. Because really the essence is the mortar. Okay, now let's look at the Rebbe's next comment on page 22, and this is the Iker, which I started talking about on Friday nights. So if you look at page 20, before we go 20, let's go back to 21. Page 20, the Alter Rebbe's instruction. The Alter Rebbe, Morar. After you eat your matzah, you should take a kazayas of morar. Yitl b'charosis, you should dip it into charosis. V'nara charosis v'rala, when you shake the charosis off, so you should not ruin the flavor of the morar. And never took it a step further and said, don't even submerge it. Better not to submerge it. Then the Alter Rebbe adds, V'yivorech bracha zu. We shall recite the following bracha. Had the Alter Rebbe not wrote the word bracha zu, would anything be missing? He could have said, like he does by matzah and other instructions. I should have had the matzah as an example so you should see. But by matzah it says, V'yivarech, and you shall bless. 2 dots. Why does he add bracha zu, this bracha? And you should make this bracha.
Because it includes the CHAROSES in the term.
Let's see. That's what there was comment on page 21. Bracha zu. On page 21 there was comment. L'chura, See me? Yeah. Do I have a Chabad Haggadah here? In my office. Okay, it doesn't matter. But when it comes to the matzah, it says v'yivarech, and you shall bless, rather than saying v'yivarech bracha zu, you shall bless. Make this bracha. So why add this bracha? Says the Rebbe on page 21. L'chora seemingly yitter lashon. This is extra wording. You didn't have to say and make this bracha. The good just said and bless v'yivarech. Asher kishadim says and so on. Why bracha zu? So ulai, perhaps therefore says the Rebbe, meram is derech hagav. He is by alluding to the fact. Shahaya makam gam levarech levracha acheres. He's telling you make this bracha because actually you could have thought that there's another bracha to do here. Which bracha? And that is the bracha of the mitzvah of CHAROSES. And if it says Alter Rebbe, make this bracha, not the CHAROSES bracha. That's why I said this one. Yeah? And the Rebbe puts in the parentheses the citations which we learned. The Rambam see the Rambam's commentary to the Mishnah, where there the Rambam says that if it were a mitzvah, you would make a bracha. And then the Rebbe says, and see the Lechem Mishnah who says, indeed, if it's a mitzvah, you should have made a bracha. And look, Lechem Mishnah concludes with the question, why don't we make a bracha? Which means what's the Rebbe saying? The Rebbe is taking this so far that all we're left with is a mitzvah, that in essence, you should have made a bracha on CHAROSES. So why don't we? Yeah. Now the Rebbe adds, you should make a bracha on. Seemingly, you should make a bracha on the mitzvah. Even though the bracha ha'etz or shahakol, you would not be doing the bracha for enjoyment. Why would you not be doing that? Why is it obvious to the Rebbe that you're not making bracha zanen and ha'etz or shahakol? Why is it obvious? No?
Suffering.
What?
Suffering.
Because whenever you dip, you don't make a bracha on the dip. You dip cracker in hummus, you don't make a bracha on the hummus. The bracha on the cracker. Especially since you're shaking it off, and you're not submerging it. So certainly no bracha on the ha'etz, but maybe you should make a bracha on the mitzvah of dipping. And therefore, it says the Alter Rebbe make this bracha to negate the thinking that you make another bracha on the mitzvah of CHAROSES. Now, why not? So in other words, the Rebbe let's do it this way. The Rebbe is deriving from the fact that the Alter Rebbe has to negate the bracha of CHAROSES. The Rebbe is deriving from there that in essence the CHAROSES is such a great mitzvah that it would warrant a bracha, but the Alter Rebbe is negating it by saying don't make the bracha, which to me is the source for how the Rebbe came to the conclusion that in the Alter Rebbe Siddur, it's preferred not to sink, not to submerge. By the very fact that the Alter Rebbe has to negate the bracha of CHAROSES, it means it's such a strong mitzvah that you should have made a bracha. Therefore, we have to say that all that's left in the CHAROSES is mitzvah. And therefore, don't submerge it. Better not to submerge. So then why are we making a bracha? The fact that we're not making a bracha on the mitzvah, thank you Hashem for the mitzvah of eating CHAROSES, or thank you Hashem for the mitzvah of dipping CHAROSES. This is because it's secondary to the marar, and it's covered by the bracha of the marar. This is parentheses from the Abudraham. Abudraham is an early commentary, middle-aged commentary on the Haggadah.
I just want to ask you,
Yeah?
the motor is the white or it's the green leaf?
Both.
Both.
The Gemara gives 5 options for what marar could be. 2 of them we have, which is the lettuce and the horseradish, are 2 out of the 5.
Or,
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so they're both marar. Now what did the Abudraham say? We don't make a bracha on the marar because it's secondary to the marar and it's covered by the bracha of marar. Now, comment the Rebbe. Al karchach, we must say, kavanosoi, the Abudraham's intention when he says no bracha on the CHAROSES because it's covered by the marar, is shemitzvasa tefela lemitzvahs marar. That the mitzvah of CHAROSES is secondary to the mitzvah of marar. Why is the Rebbe concluding that? Maybe the Abudraham's talking about the bracha of nehenin, of pleasure. Maybe the Abudraham's talking about the bracha of eitz. Why is the Rebbe convinced that the Abudraham's talking about the bracha of the mitzvah? Very simple. What bracha do you make on marar? You make adama?
No.
No.
Because
When do you make adama?
You don't.
Like harpas.
Right.
So if the
Oh, you have in
Abudraham
mind
is,
for
you have
the-
in mind. So if the Abudraham is saying that the bracha on the marar covers the CHAROSES, he's not talking about the hadama because you didn't make a hadama on the marar.
You don't make
This is my suggestion of how the Rebbe concludes that the Abudraham must talk about the bracha of the mitzvah and not the bracha of the nen and of the eitz, because otherwise he would have said that because the charoses is a toffel, it doesn't get a brachas nenin. But by saying nifteres b'brachos, it's covered by the bracha of the maror. It means specifically the bracha that you just recited on the maror covers the charoses. The only bracha you recited on the maror is the mitzvah bracha, which means it's a mitzvah that's toffel. It's a mitzvah that's secondary.
You already washed at this point, so the order would be.
Nothing to do with
Okay,
wash.
we're gonna leave that.
What does
Good,
washing have to do?
good kasha. Very good kasha. If you already washed Ramotzi, yeah. So why do you have to have in mind the bracha by karpas?
Yeah.
Excellent question. Whole pilpul
Okay.
available on YouTube. Remind me, I'll send you the shiurim I give on this. Why you have to have in mind by karpas the bracha adam of maror, if anyways it's going to be covered by the hamotzi. And the answer is the machlokes if it's covered by the hamotzi, which is why you have to eat less than the by the karpas. Remind it thereafter. I'll send you the shir.
Then it's a bracha levatala.
Okay, we'll explain. Look on the YouTube.
Wow.
Uh-huh.
And more is bitter.
You couldn't make a bracha on something bitter. You just can't make a bracha on that which is not the way of eating,
For example?
like raw oil.
People love. People eat it all year round.
So if someone wants to just drink oil for health reasons, they have people to do
Oh,
that.
it's a good question. That's the only time you might make a bracha. This is a
Okay.
ma'aseh in the Gemara, which is in the Rambam. Okay, so let's come back here. Let's get back here. So the hadama is off the table. You're not making hadama. So the Abu Draham says that the charoses is secondary to the maror, and therefore it's covered by the bracha of the maror. We must be talking about the only bracha recited on the maror, which is the bracha of mitzvah. So now, which means therefore that the mitzvah, the Abu Draham is learning, therefore, that the mitzvah of charoses is secondary to the mitzvah of maror. Where do you have such a thing? When one mitzvah is secondary to another.
When one mitzvah is secondary.
What does it have? In fact, we have a principle. Ain't oisim misses chavilas. You don't wrap mitzvahs one to the other. What does it mean you have a mitzvah that's secondary to another? So I got two examples that people gave me over Shabbos, since I asked it Friday night. Very gratified people are listening and thinking about it. So you mentioned tefillin. When the Chabad custom, you make one bracha on your hand tefillin, Chabad and Sephardi custom, and it covers the head tefillin. Two separate mitzvahs, covered by one bracha. Good suggestion, but we spoke about this Friday night.
Yeah.
One's not secondary to the other. It's two different mitzvahs. It happens to be covered by one bracha, right? That's probably, I was thinking about it actually. And maybe it's similar to, this is a big pilpul maybe, but maybe it's similar to how you make one bracha eitz, even though couples an apple and an orange. So you make one bracha on tefillin, and it covers two mitzvahs that are both tefillin. Maybe that's what it is, because apple and orange are both eitz. So maybe you have one bracha on tefillin, but they're not not secondary to the other, right? Right? Maybe you have to make a big pilpul, because for example, what's the halacha? A person's making two bris milas, one after the other. A boy is doing two bris milas. Does it make two bracha?
Different times, no?
So I was there. We've had twins.
No, what do they do?
Make a bracha for each.
But does he make a hefsek in
And
the middle?
if you have to make a half hour.
Oh, if you make a hefsek.
Half hour
Otherwise,
for each
exactly. Because otherwise you would make one bracha for both.
Yeah.
Not because one's secondary to the other,
That's why
because they're both the same mitzvah. If you don't make a hefsek, you can make another bracha. So two tefillin, which is why the Ashkenazim, when they make the second bracha, then they're making bracha portion from bracha to levayit.
Yeah.
Because maybe you shouldn't have made the bracha.
Yeah.
And if you make a hefsek, you have to make a second bracha.
Yeah.
Right? But it's not because one's secondary to the other. Okay. So what's someone else suggests another example where one mitzvah is secondary to the other, where you want to say something, sorry?
No, I'm just saying, can you actually do one bracha for big twins?
Theory.
In theory, yeah.
In theory, yes. We don't because we make a hefsek. We want to give each its own rights. We make a hefsek. Yes. Anyway, it's a machloket. It's a big discussion. But this would play into that. With the tefillin, the two tefillin mitzvahs might play into that. But it's not the same as here, which is one mitzvah secondary to the other. Which is like, to begin with, it's secondary.
What was the other example?
Another example someone gave to me was tzitzis. Someone who wears only talis katan, a bacher before he's married in Chabad, makes a bracha on the tzitzis he wears, the talis katan.
Yeah.
And then if you're married, you don't make a bracha on your katan. You only make a bracha on the big one, and it covers the other one. So again, same thing. It's not one
What
secondary
if
to the
you're not
other.
married
It's one mitzvah. Sorry,
What if you're not married anymore? Because you said before.
the Chabad custom
Still
is
wear
you
the
still wear
talis.
your big talis.
You tell.
Yeah, that's the Chabad custom. Now, once you put it on, you don't take it off. In general, that's the rule. Once you've elevated in holiness, you don't go down. So once you started putting on the talis when you're davening, you don't take it off. Sorry.
I thought Ashkenaz takes it off. They're divorced.
Oh, really? I don't know. I
You
know.
shouldn't know.
I've seen.
I don't
know.
I've seen. I don't know if it's right or wrong. I've seen, but I can't tell you if it's right or wrong. Just because I've seen
Yeah, I
people
don't
do
know.
that, I can't judge.
Okay,
them.
so let's conclude now. So now the kasha is, sorry?
No,
Only Chabad.
Spartan.
Now what, to what?
Only Spartan were that only after bar mitzvah.
Only Spartans?
Yeah,
That were what, was it?
that were taught gadol by before they're married.
Only Spartan?
Yeah, pretty much. If
Well,
if an Ashkenaz does it, it's
don't.
because they decided
And
to do it.
Ashkenaz
Let's
are
do
most
it.
part. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. Okay, so now the question becomes, what does this mean that one mitzvah is secondary to another? Now listen to Rebbe's beautiful words. Yesh levayer. We might suggest, Apima shekasa Maharal, based on that which the Maharal writes. Now we're going to quote the Maharal. Now, when we quote the Maharal, it's a nice explanation in the if you read the Maharal isolated, it would be a nice word about CHAROSES. Wouldn't necessarily have a halachic bearing. But from the fact that Rebbe is linking it to the Abu Dhaham as a halachic bearing, it means he's learning the Maharal in a particular way. And let's see. He's learning it as a halachic factor. CHAROSES mitzvah. Zelushan, and now quoting the Maharal. CHAROSES is a mitzvah. Why? With respect to the marar, the only thing mentioned there, is marar, remember, the pasuk says, is to remember the bitter times. What's the pasuk say? Shemaru is chayayim, they made their lives embittered, b'avodah kasha, with hard work. V'yesh miridus la'adam b'avodah kasha. And a person, when he does hard work, has bitterness. Aval einim miridus gomer. Hard work is not complete and full bitterness. Lachain, therefore, oisim zechelatit, you make a remembrance to the mortar. The end of our yoiser kasha min meleches hatit. There's no harder work than the labor of making mortar. Shekain amru Rabbi Seinu zechem levracha shmais rabba. That's what the Medrash tells us, that the hardest work is making mortar. So because the morar doesn't go far enough in remembering how bitter it was, because the morar just talked about bitterness in general, therefore you have CHAROSES to tell you, no, the bitterness is so bitter that it's even mortar bitter. End quote the Maharal. So the Rebbe is linking this Maharal to the Abu Dhaham. What's the Rebbe saying?
That the
What is the
Marar
Abu Dhaham?
bracha covers
Why?
because it's one in the same remembrance.
It's not just two mitzvahs
Ah.
and one is secondary to
But
the
then
other.
it shouldn't be the
It's an extension of one mitzvah, really. The mitzvah more is to remember bitter. It
Right.
doesn't go far enough. Have mortar. So take the mortar to its end conclusion.
question.
So now it explains why you don't have to have a kazayas. It's an extension of the mortar. You don't have to make a bracha. It's an extension, or not you don't have to make a bracha. You are making a bracha on the mitzvah of CHAROSES. Because the mitzvah of CHAROSES is not another mitzvah. And if you looked at Abu Dhaham itself, you would say there's two mitzvahs. One mortar, one CHAROSES. And this one's secondary to that. What kind of thing is this? One mitzvah secondary to another. Comes the Rebbe and takes the Maharal and says, no, it's not one mitzvah secondary to another. There's really, in essence, one mitzvah to remember the bitterness. Now, the biblical commandment to remember the bitterness is, remember it was bitter. Come the sages and say, we want you to understand how really bitter it was. So make sure you add the CHAROSES. So it's really an extension of the same mitzvah. It's a beautiful Rishmak of art. We didn't have a chance to. We didn't go back to the Rebbe's other commentary. But if you go back to the Rebbe's other commentary, see, it comes out perfect. And now we understand why the Rebbe eliminated every other part of CHAROSES. No kappa, no apple orchard where the Hashem blessed them to remember that they gave birth under. Because once you start introducing other things that aren't an extension of mortar, now you're giving other components to the CHAROSES. Maybe he has to bracha.
Right.
But if the Alter Rebbe said that you don't make a bracha on CHAROSES, and the Alter Rebbe said specifically, make this bracha of maror, because I don't want you to make CHAROSES bracha. Because in theory, if CHAROSES was a separate mitzvah, you would make a bracha. Which means the Alter Rebbe is learning that it's not a separate mitzvah. It's a singular mitzvah. Therefore, CHAROSES cannot be anything else but mortar. Not kappa, and therefore don't submerge it.
This is the same opinion
Comes out beautiful.
that's held in
Amen.
Sephardi and Ashkenaz.
Huh?
or-
So the practice is the same.
No,
Nobody
practice-
submerges,
Practice is
and
the
everybody
same.
shakes it off. But the explanation now from the Rebbe comes out beautiful. All the opinions get aligned perfectly. All the details of CHAROSES come aligned perfectly with this word.
Why are we saying the bracha of achilas mar? Make it that the bracha is to remember the bitterness.
That is the mitzvah to eat maror, which is to remember the bitterness. And I'm extending that bracha by the commandment of the sages into the CHAROSES also. It's the same commandment to remember bitterness. That is the achilas maror. It's just you take it all the way to its extreme conclusion by dipping into the
So
CHAROSES.
why do you eat the CHAROSES with the sandwich?
Why do you?
Good question.
What do you mean?
Who
Because it's mar.
Who learned
If-
the Karach files last year?
I don't know.
Remember?
I remember.
We
I
learned the
learned it, but
Kairach
I don't-
files.
Yeah.
We learned that the Kairach, the sandwich, is not in fulfillment
It's
of the
based
mitzvah
on
of matzah.
Mikdash.
It's in the fulfillment of the mitzvah of maror. We learned it last year.
Right.
So yes, you would. But now this explains also,
Oh, because it's the mortar. Because you're having the mortar.
Correct.
Okay.
because the proper way to fulfill the mitzvah of maror, according to Hillel, is by having matzah with it, as we learned last year.
Right.
This also explains. Rambam is of the view that you actually dip the matzah into charoses also.
Right. We don't do that
We don't.
because it's because of water, or no?
Right.
So the Rebbe disagrees. What's the machlek come down to? The Rebbe has a beautiful explanation. The Rebbe has another explanation in one of his talks elsewhere. But bottom line is, because matzah has two elements. Remember, they ran out of Egypt, which is freedom. And the other is halach manya. This is the blood of affliction that our forefathers ate in Egypt before they left. So maror has an affliction element and has a freedom element. Right? So from one component, because it's a affliction element, maybe you should put in charoses. But if it's a freedom element, no charoses. And if we limit our charoses to the purely afflicted, as the Rebbe is learning, because the charoses is really to take the affliction to its ultimate extreme conclusion. So it is an extension of the mitzvah of maror, not a separate mitzvah that's secondary, but it's an extension of the mitzvah of maror. Comes out beautiful. What do you want to say? Sorry, I interrupted you. You were going to say something.
You have to dip it, huh? Like anywhere you put it in, it has to be dipped.
Yeah, and that would explain, by the way, why you don't have to eat anything. You don't even have to eat. As long as you put the maror into charoses. In other words, the essence of the mitzvah is to make an association between your maror to the extreme bitterness of the mortar.
We're still gonna eat the process in the south.
So you end up eating it, but we actually end up taking it off. So you barely even eat any of it. Like you still put the maror in there to demonstrate that my maror bitterness is going as far as the mortar. As long as I did that, it's fine. I don't have to actually end up eating it.
That's held by all.
Yeah, shake it off. It's halachi, shake it off. Because it doesn't make a difference. It's not about the flavor of it. It's about making the maror go to its extreme. I did that already by dipping it. Comes out beautiful. Okay, a wonderful day, everybody, and a chag kosher sameach, happy, healthy, kosher Pesach, a real Pesach of freedom. Freedom for everyone, all the Eden, especially those who are in captivity, should really have their freedom this Pesach. Amen. A wonderful day, Eden.
Thank you, Rabbi.
How about